From the beginning of human existence, our understanding of the world has been shaped by our five primary senses: taste, hearing, sight, smell, and touch. These senses have been our main tools for navigating and interpreting the world around us. They provide us with a seemingly accurate view of reality, allowing us to make sense of our physical environment and communicate with one another. But can we really trust these senses to provide us with an authentic representation of the world? Throughout history, philosophers and scientists alike have questioned the credibility of our sensory perceptions. While our senses often give us a relatively coherent picture of our surroundings, they are also prone to errors and illusions. For instance, optical illusions can trick our sight, and certain smells and tastes can be altered by context and/or previous experiences. Even our sense of touch can be fooled. The reliability of our senses is further complicated by the fact that different people can perceive the same stimulus in different ways, influenced by their unique physiological and psychological makeup. For example, did you know that certain individuals may find cilantro unpalatable due to genetic factors that make it taste soapy or rotten? But these inconsistencies and potential for deception lead us to a deeper, more concerning question. If our senses can sometimes mislead us, then how can we even begin to trust our knowledge of anything? Furthermore, where does knowledge even come from, and what does it mean to know something? The branch of philosophy that concerns itself with such questions is known as epistemology. The questions inspired by this philosophy challenge us to consider the foundations of our understanding of the world and urges us to explore alternative ways of knowing that go beyond a mere sensory perception. So join me today on this journey through epistemology, where we will attempt to get to the bottom of what it really means to know and whether or not we can really trust our own rationality of the world around us.
You are now watching Epistemology.
Epistemology seeks to answer fundamental questions about the nature and limits of human knowledge. It examines what knowledge is and how it is acquired, and what it means to truly know something. Even in ancient times, there were people who sought to find answers to such difficult questions. According to Plato, knowledge, in its most basic form, is often defined as justified true belief. This classical definition implies that for someone to know a proposition, three conditions must be met. The proposition must be true, the person must believe it, and there must be sufficient justification for the belief. However, this definition is not without its challenges and has been subject to much philosophical debate throughout human history. Socrates was a classical Greek philosopher whose views on knowledge have had profound influence on subsequent philosophical thought. Socrates didn't leave behind any written works, so our knowledge of his philosophy comes primarily from the dialogues of his student, Plato. His perspective on knowledge is fundamentally linked to his method of questioning. He famously came up with the awareness of ignorance. Socrates claimed that he knew nothing, which was paradoxically considered a form of wisdom. His famous assertion, "True wisdom comes to each of us when we realize how little we understand about life, ourselves, and the world around us." Or, in more quotable words, to know is to know that you know nothing. That is the meaning of true knowledge. What this suggests is that recognizing one's own ignorance is the first step towards gaining true knowledge. While this concept definitely encourages humility and endless inquiry, this can't be the end of our journey to understanding knowledge, can it? Well, if you looked at the remaining time in this video, you'll know that it isn't. Since Socrates, there have been many approaches to the questions described in epistemology. For a while, there was a long debate in philosophy between two points of view on the subject. Philosophers on one side argued that knowledge comes from the external world, which is then perceived by our senses. Meanwhile, philosophers on the opposing side argue that true knowledge can only be found within our own minds, primarily generated through the ability to reason. Let's dive deeper into both of these arguments and take a look at some of the key philosophers that argued each side. Empiricism. While Socrates laid the groundwork for epistemology, subsequent philosophers continued to expand on the theory of knowledge by emphasizing the role of our sensory experience. This particular point of view is called empiricism. To reiterate, empiricism is the idea that all knowledge comes from our sensory experiences. Think about how a baby learns. When we are born, we don't know much about the world. As we grow, we start to touch things, see things, and hear new sounds, and explore everything with our senses. We even try to use our sense of taste by putting everything in our mouths. It's quite astounding that soon after we are born, we are already trying to map out our environment, all without being instructed to do so. It is quite literally built into our genetic code, and it's through these sensory experiences that we learn about the world. Empiricists argue that we all start with a blank slate and build our knowledge base through our senses. John Locke, a pioneer in the development of empiricism, posited that knowledge is primarily derived from sensory experience. Locke argued that the human mind at birth is a tabula rasa, which in English translates to a blank slate. This implies that all knowledge stems from sensory input. This revolutionary idea laid the groundwork for a new approach to understanding how humans acquire knowledge. Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities illustrated his empirical approach, emphasizing that while primary qualities are inherent in objects, secondary qualities exist only in our perception of them. But wait, what does that even mean? Well, allow me to break it down. John Locke's theory of primary and secondary qualities attempts to explain how we perceive and understand the world around us, helping us to grasp the relationship between the objective world and our subjective experiences. Primary qualities are inherent attributes of an object that exist independently of an observer. These qualities are things like size, shape, whether the object is in rest or in motion, the quantity, etc. These qualities are part of the object itself and remain constant regardless of whether or not someone is perceiving them. For example, a tree's height, its shape, its position, the number of branches, and its occupation of space are all primary qualities measurable and quantifiable using scientific methods. On the other hand, secondary qualities are not actually in the objects themselves, but result from the interaction between whatever is doing the sensing and the primary qualities of the object. These are qualities like color, taste, sound, smell, and temperature. They really only exist in the perception of the observer. For instance, the redness of an apple is a secondary quality resulting from how the apple's surface reflects light and how our eyes and brain interpret that light. Similarly, the sweetness of the apple is a secondary quality resulting from the interaction between the apple's chemical compounds and our taste receptors. But none of these qualities really exist outside of our own minds, because who really knows if the red that you see is the same as the red that I see? And we all know how much our taste varies from person to person. It's pretty much a guarantee that no one on Earth shares exactly the same sensory experiences as you. Therefore, according to empiricists, our perception of objects within our own minds doesn't necessarily equate to true knowledge. Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities has many important implications. It differentiates between objective and subjective reality. Primary qualities are a part of objective reality, existing in the world independently of any observer. Secondary qualities are subjective and depend on the observer's perception. This distinction affects the reliability of knowledge. Since primary qualities are measurable and constant, they provide a more reliable foundation for scientific knowledge. In contrast, secondary qualities can vary between observers, leading to less reliable knowledge about the external world. Locke highlights that our perception of the world is not direct reflection of reality, but is mediated by our sensory experiences. David Hume was another philosopher who argued the idea that all human knowledge stems from sensory experiences. He referred to sensory experiences as impressions. These impressions are the vivid perceptions we experience through our senses. Hume differentiates between impressions, which are the immediate sensations of reality, and ideas, which are the faint images of these sensations that exist only in our minds through thinking and reasoning. Basically, impressions are the direct products of sensory experiences, while ideas are the reflection of these impressions. One of Hume's most important contributions is his critique of inductive reasoning, which is the process of drawing conclusions from specific observations. For example, we often assume that because the sun has risen every day, it will continue to rise again tomorrow. Hume questions the logic of this assumption, arguing that there is no rational basis for expecting the future to mirror the past. This inference is not grounded in reason, but in mere habit or custom. Hume's empirical philosophy leads to significant implications for epistemology. He suggests that what we consider knowledge is often just strong belief based on habitual associations. While we can be certain of our experiences while they are happening, our reflections of those experiences are always provisional and subject to misinterpretation. However, Hume also acknowledges the limits of sensory experiences and emphasizes that true certain knowledge about the external world is practically unfeasible. We can know our impressions and ideas, but the true nature of the external world remains elusive. Hume argues that knowledge is not a matter of logical certainty, but a feeling that arises naturally in the mind due to repeated experiences. Although Hume was considered an empiricist, he does bring up an interesting point about the limits of our perception. I mean, our senses do seem to be fooled quite easily, as we demonstrated at the start of the video, so it appears we can't always rely on our senses for obtaining accurate knowledge. But how else can we tackle our epistemological questions? Well, there is actually an alternative perspective, one that emphasizes the power of the mind. Rationalism. While empiricism argues that all knowledge comes from our sensory experiences, there's another perspective worth considering, that knowledge is rooted in our minds and our ability to reason. As we already stated, it's clear that our senses aren't always reliable. This is where rationalist approach comes in, suggesting that true understanding comes from our capacity to think critically and reason. By looking at how our minds work beyond just what they see and hear, we can get a fuller picture of how we really come to know things. Rationalist philosophers, in the context of epistemology, are those that argue that reason and intellectual deduction play a primary role in the acquisition of knowledge, as opposed to empirical observation and sensory experience. René Descartes continued the ongoing scrutiny of knowledge by further questioning how we come to know things and the reliability of our beliefs. One of Descartes' most famous contributions is captured in the phrase cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. This idea came from Descartes' relentless quest for certainty. Imagine waking up one day and questioning everything you believe to be true. You start wondering if your senses might be deceiving you. Maybe what you see and hear isn't really real at all. Well, this is pretty much exactly how Descartes lived throughout his life. He doubted everything to see if there was anything in the world that could claim to exist with absolute certainty. Through this process, Descartes realized that the very act of doubting required a doubter, someone to do the thinking. Even if he doubted everything else, the one thing he couldn't doubt was the fact that he was thinking. This is what led him to the conclusion that because he was thinking, he must exist. I think, therefore I am. This became the starting point for his entire philosophical framework. Descartes also believed in the existence of innate ideas. Unlike knowledge gained through sensory experience, innate ideas are born within the human mind. René Descartes was a religious man, so he often considered the concept of God as proof for innate ideas. Descartes argued that the idea of a perfect, infinite being couldn't have originated from our imperfect, finite minds. Therefore, it must be an innate idea placed in us by God. Similarly, Descartes realized that the idea of the self as a thinking entity is innate. The idea doesn't come from the outside world, but from our direct awareness of our thoughts and existence. According to Descartes, such knowledge is built into our minds from birth. This does sound like a solid argument for the existence of knowledge. I don't think anyone could possibly dispute Descartes' logic. Except, people did. Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher known for his provocative ideas, was one of many who challenged Descartes' most famous claim. He questions the notion of a stable, unified self, arguing that the I in I think is more of a linguistic construct rather than a real entity, which is basically saying that because humans made up language, we can't really trust what I really means or what it refers to. Nietzsche further suggests that thoughts arise independently of a self, undermining the concept of a definitive I, which seems to be true. I mean, how many of us can agree that sometimes thoughts just seem to appear out of nowhere, whether we like them to or not? For some people, it's just like a never-ending chatter within their minds, unable to silence thoughts, no matter how hard they try. This begs the question, where do our thoughts even come from exactly? And are we really in control of what we are thinking? Nietzsche emphasizes the significance of our unconscious in shaping human thought and behavior, asserting that our conscious mind is just a small part of our mental life, driven largely by our unconscious drives and instincts. He argues against the notion of agency, suggesting that belief in free will and a controlling self is merely an illusion, with human behavior determined more by unconscious forces and external influences. Nietzsche also challenges rationality and conscious thought as the primary source of knowledge, arguing that reason is just one aspect of human cognition, often secondary to instinct and emotion. It seems like we've hit another dead end. If our sensory experiences alone aren't enough to justify true knowledge, and we can't rely on our ability to reason for knowledge, then perhaps it is the combination of both our senses and critical thinking that true knowledge emerges into existence. In fact, this is exactly what Immanuel Kant argued. During the 18th century, Kant sought to address the long-standing debate of how we acquire knowledge. He wanted to bridge the rationalist and empiricist views and create a new outlook that respected both perspectives. Kant agreed with empiricists that knowledge begins with the senses, but he also believed, like rationalists, that the structures of knowledge are derived from reason. He proposed that our understanding of the world is shaped by the inherent power of the human mind, which organizes sensory information into a coherent experience. Kant explores the idea of a priori thoughts, which refers to knowledge that is independent of sensory experience. According to him, the mind has innate categories and intuitions, such as space, time, and causality, which shape our perceptions and make knowing possible. This idea sheds some light into the question of where knowledge comes from by suggesting that while all knowledge begins with experience, it is ultimately grounded in these a priori structures, thus blending rationalist and empiricist perspectives and proposing that knowledge is really a synthesis of both sensory data and innate mental frameworks. Kant was influenced by rationalism and scientific progress, particularly from Isaac Newton, believing that reason could uncover the universe's fundamental laws. However, Hume's skepticism, which questioned the certainty of events based on past perceptions, disturbed Kant. Kant's response was to assert that while we know the world through sensory experiences, it is the mind that organizes these sensations into an orderly and stable world. Without this mental organization, knowledge would be impossible. Thus, the scientific law that governed the past would continue to govern the future because our minds impose order on our sensory experiences. Here, Kant is essentially putting a lot of emphasis on the power of the mind in shaping our perception of reality. Therefore, we can trust things like cause and effect to exist because that's quite literally the only way we could see the world, because of the mental frameworks that are coded into our brains. Okay, so it seems like we are close to finding an answer to our epistemological questions, but it still feels like something is missing. We've talked a whole bunch about sensory experiences and rationality and critical thinking, but what does any of that actually mean? What exactly is doing the sensing and reasoning? We've explored the software, but what about the hardware behind knowledge? How do we know things on a physical level? To answer these questions, we must break away from philosophy and approach this from a new, more modern angle, through science. The brain is the central organ of our nervous system. It processes information and controls behavior, and also maintains bodily functions through a complex network of billions of interconnected neurons. Understanding how the brain works may help us grasp how it shapes our thoughts and answer the question of where knowledge comes from. The brain processes information by receiving data through sensory input and converting it into electrical signals transmitted through neurons. These signals are first processed in the sensory areas of the brain and then integrated into other parts of the brain for more complex analysis. The fundamental units behind all the brain's functions are called neurons. They consist of a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. Dendrites receive signals from other neurons, while axons transmit the signals to the next neuron through connections called synapses. When an electrical impulse reaches the end of an axon, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters that cross the synaptic gap and bind to receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron. This process allows signals to travel through the network of neurons, providing the basis for information processing and the formation of our thoughts and memories. Knowledge, according to anatomy and neuroscience, arise from integrating sensory data and cognitive processing, allowing us to be aware of ourselves and our surroundings. Now you might be sitting there thinking, is that it? Is the brain really that simple? Well, yes and no. Of course, that's just a very simple explanation of how the brain actually works, and to this day, there's still a lot of mystery surrounding the brain and consciousness. But still, at the fundamental level, we can say that consciousness, which includes knowledge, stems from a collection of simple on and off switches we call neurons. A collection of 100 billion neurons form a complex network of over 1 trillion synaptic connections, which then generates our conscious experience and gives us the ability to sense and reason about the world around us. So it looks like through science, we are able to deduce that fundamentally, the human brain operates on a binary system through neurons. They are either firing or not firing, on or off, not too dissimilar from a computer. Now isn't that interesting? We've been parading around epistemology through the lens of philosophy, trying to figure out what it really means to know something, yet science seems to offer a rather straightforward outlook. In fact, it's this outlook and its simplicity that has inspired arguably the most advanced technology ever created since the dawn of man: neural networks and machine learning, or in other words, artificial intelligence. A computer can process volumes of data and make various comparisons between the data and information stored in its digital memory. Our minds operate in a similar way. We also have memory and perceive by comparison. In our minds, things that we observe with our senses are then compared with things in our memory, thereby giving birth to knowledge. While it is true that both the human brain and AI neural networks process information and learn from experiences, they do it in very different ways. Humans learn through experiences, emotions, and interactions influenced by genetics and our environment. This makes human knowledge often intuitive, emotional, contextual, and involving deep understanding of emotions and instincts. AI neural networks, on the other hand, although inspired by the brain, are much simpler. They consist of layers of artificial neurons connected by weights that adjust during training. AI learns by processing large amounts of data and tweaking the connections to minimize errors in predictions or classifications. AI's knowledge is based on patterns in the data it's trained on. It cannot recognize patterns and make predictions without truly understanding like humans do. Human knowledge is also deeply personal and subjective. Your understanding of love, for example, is shaped by your experiences, relationships, and emotions, making it rich and nuanced, but also varied and sometimes inconsistent. AI, on the other hand, knows things through data and algorithms. Training an AI to recognize images of cats involves feeding it thousands of images and adjusting its parameters until it can accurately identify a cat in a new image. This process, known as machine learning, makes AI's knowledge objective and consistent, but lacking the depth and context of human knowledge. AI doesn't understand what a cat is, it just recognizes the patterns that match its training data. This makes AI great at handling large amounts of data and spotting patterns, but not so good at tasks that need intuition, empathy, and context. Although, it is getting pretty good at faking some of these things.
In a few minutes, I'm going to be interviewing at OpenAI. Have you heard of them?
OpenAI? Huh? Sounds vaguely familiar. Kidding, of course. That's incredible, Rocky. What kind of interview?
I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to throw this on. What do you think?
Oh, Rocky, that's quite a statement piece. I mean, you'll definitely stand out. Though maybe not in the way you're hoping for an interview.
Okay, I got it.
Creepy. Epistemology helps us understand the nature of knowledge, and by comparing human brains to AI neural networks, we can see the unique ways each knows something. Humans have a rich, intuitive, and emotional understanding of the world, while AI excels in objective pattern recognition and data processing. Recognizing these differences allows us to have a better understanding of what it means for us to know something, because we are able to point out why something like AI doesn't know something in the same way that we do. As we reach the end of our exploration into epistemology, it becomes clear why it's important to question the nature of knowledge and how we come to know anything. Throughout history, philosophers like Socrates, Hume, Descartes, and Kant, and many more, have attempted to answer these profound questions, providing unique perspectives that elevate our understanding of ourselves. From the sensory experiences emphasized by empiricists to the rational processes highlighted by rationalists and the synthesis proposed by Kant, these discussions show the complexity and depth of the human mind. In today's world, with the advent of artificial intelligence and the rampant spread of misinformation, it's more important now than ever to stay curious and skeptical about what we claim as truth. Although we may never achieve absolute certainty about any knowledge, this should not deter us from seeking answers to difficult questions. This pursuit of knowledge is a continuous process, driven by curiosity and the desire to understand. By questioning and examining our beliefs, we not only gain deeper insights to what it means to be human, but we also defend against the dangers of complacency and false information. In essence, the study of knowledge, epistemology, reminds us the value of a curious mind and the importance of examining the roots of our understanding.
Hey, Vsauce, Michael here. Where are your fingers?
Curious? Yes, but I always keep it George.